Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about transforming narratives as part of the DEIA, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Anti-Racism series that's being sponsored by 3 master's programs from the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. And the 3 programs are Nonprofit Management, Human Capital Management, and Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. And today, we will have Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program presenting. My name is Beth Fisher Yoshida, and I am the Program Director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Master's Program at Columbia University. And I am a professor of practice and do a lot of work in the area of women and negotiation and youth leadership and community building. And we'll talk more about that later, but I'd like to introduce my co-hosts and have them say something about themselves. First, we have Patricia Haynes. Pat, would you like to say something about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm unmuted, I believe.
You are.
Thank you. I spent a few years in the master's program at Columbia in negotiation and conflict resolution. After 30 years at the National Broadcasting Network in research and TV network sales, it was very eye-opening. And then I went to my present career, which is teaching, conflict resolution, and mediating. I've been mediating for the last 20 years and have mediated over 1,000 cases.
Ooh. Thank you for that, Pat. We'll hear more from Pat a little bit later. And now we have Sergey Van Middendorp.
Thank you, Beth, and hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Sergey Van Middendorp, and I consider myself to be a scholar and a practitioner, although most of my time nowadays is spent practicing systems design in the Netherlands. And with a small team, we are currently trying to make the Dutch healthcare system more integrative and integral. And I will share a bit more about my scholarly work on metaphor today and how we could use that to look at transforming narratives.
Great, thank you. So in order to set the context a little bit more, we're going to be talking about how we think about narratives, the stories we tell, the stories we carry, how they influence our behavior and so on, as it applies to DEI&A work. And logistically, we are recording this session and the link will be available in a few days on the Columbia University Negotiation and Conflict Resolution website on the events page. It will be available through our YouTube channel and you will receive a link if you're registered and when you receive a thank you letter. So to start us off in this presentation today, Sergey will go first. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. Then Pat will present, we'll have a little discussion, I will present. And then we open it up to all of you, the audience, to please write your questions in the Q&A box and we will pay attention to them towards the end of the presentation. We should have at least a third of the presentation time dedicated to Q&A. So the chat box is dysfunctioned and that's why we ask you, that's why we ask you to please write your questions at any time you have them in the Q&A box. All right, so then without further ado, I guess, Sergey, you can take it away.
Thank you, Beth. So what I want to share with you is how we can use metaphor theory and practice as one resource to transform narratives. And then specifically in the context of our topic today, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to do that, I will share some metaphor theory and practice first, so we have some frame. And then I will share a story, a long-running story from the Netherlands that has recently been transforming, in which systemic racism is embodied, and which we are dealing with right now in our culture. And then we can step back from that story and possibly see how we can use those metaphor theories to amplify the transformations we want to move towards more diversity, equity, and inclusion. So having said that, let me start with these metaphor theories. So what I want to offer is 3 theories of metaphor that each are rooted in the idea of conceptual metaphor. What does conceptual metaphor mean? This means that metaphors are not only a matter of language in which we compare one thing to another in order to make sense of that other, but these are also a matter of our whole being in an environment, in relationship with an environment, where the interaction in the environment through our senses, our feelings, our emotions and thoughts then first become apparent in language as metaphors. And most of the times we are not aware of those metaphors being used as metaphors to make sense of something abstract, but we can become aware of them. And these three theories sort of build on each other or complement each other, and together represent an emergent practice that we can use to become more aware of metaphor, and through that they offer us a huge lever to transform our stories. At least that's my experience, and that's what I wanted to share with you today. And as mentioned, this is only one way to look at this, but maybe it's a good way to look at it. So first, as I said, the conceptual metaphors that arise in the body-mind-environment continuum. These are mostly non-conscious. I'll give you two examples of those in a minute. Then there is the idea of generative metaphor theory, where we deliberately and consciously use metaphor to form a new idea or to shape a new design or to invite a new future. This builds on the same capacity that we have to use metaphor non-consciously, but now it becomes an act of conscious construction. So these two complement each other and build from the same base. And the third, which is at the bottom, which you could say we can call critical metaphor theory, wonders whether we are aware of metaphor as metaphor or not. And as long as we are not aware of metaphors being used as metaphors, one of the leading theorists here says the metaphor has us, whereas when we deliberately use the metaphor, we have the metaphor. So this is a critical question we can ask ourselves from that perspective. Do we have the metaphor, or does the metaphor have us? Let me share a few examples of these theories just to give them some more meaning. So starting with conceptual metaphor theory, in our everyday experience, from the moment we are born, we have a co-occurrence of physical experiences, like in this case, being held by a father. And if this experience repeats itself often enough and the setting is warm and loving, then a relationship is made in our experience continuously between this feeling of physical warmth and this feeling of affection. And this creates the primary metaphor: warmth is affection, which in turn leads to expressions in our language like a warm smile or a warm person. And when we say these things, the areas in our brain and our bodies that relate to the early childhood experience that created the metaphor are actually activated to make sense of what the person says or how the metaphor is being used. And we have a few hundred of these primary metaphors, which seem to be universal. So building on these metaphors, next slide, please, we make complex metaphors to deal with increasingly abstract concepts. For example, the financial crisis of 2008, 2010 was often framed as a natural disaster. But you could also think of love as a journey. So important abstract concepts are given complex metaphors. So we talk about houses that are underwater, markets that are shaken, prices that are falling. Even the measures that we come up with, like the temporary asset relief program, a TARP, sort of fits coherently within that metaphorical framework that we use to make sense of a more complex subject. And most of the time, these metaphors are simmering beyond the horizon of awareness and do their work, making meaning for us in the background. And in this case, we can wonder what entailments this metaphor has. So it highlights certain aspects that we can use to understand this, even though our houses are not really underwater. It also hides things. In this case, the human responsibility for the financial crisis, because who is responsible for a natural disaster? So this is slowly building the bridge to the critical metaphor theory. So next slide, please. When we talk about generative metaphors, we deliberately use metaphor to see something as something in order to create a new reality. So when designers try to create an artificial brush using artificial hair, they try to copy the hair of the donkeys that went into the natural brush, but they didn't really succeed because the hair split at the end and the paint on the wall became sloppy. So when one of the designers says, what if we saw the brush as a pump? Their perspective changed and they saw the brush as a pump, and then the focus shifted to the space between the hairs. And they could solve the issue with the paint being sloppy by switching their metaphor. So deliberately choosing another metaphor to see reality in a different way and working together to see what the implications are can change the reality. And we are all familiar with such generative metaphors that have been used, for example, in the design of human-computer interaction. Yeah? The physical desk that we've had for a long time translated into a desktop metaphor for our desktop computers. And the tablet that was used in ancient Rome to make text was a model that helped us create a tablet computer. So we see these around us and are often used by designers all the time. So the critical metaphor theory then asks, are we aware that we have a metaphor, or does the metaphor have us? And if you know the movie behind this moment, The Truman Show, Truman grew up in a metaphor that was created for him, well, not for him, around him, so that people could watch his life on television. But at some point in his life, a lamp falls down, and this is so incoherent in his world that he looks up and he says, what just happened? And this is the moment that he became aware that he was living in an artificial world that was created for him, enabled him to explore this new world in a different way and actually physically arrive at the horizon of understanding and make a transition into another world. So this bridge between aware and non-aware, deliberate and non-deliberate, is an important thing in using these ideas in our narratives. So let's now switch to an example of a long-running story in the Netherlands that is transforming and that has transformed a few times over time and that needs transforming in our context today. It's the story of Saint Nicholas and Black Pete. So in one way of telling this story, it started when Saint Nicholas of Myra passed away in 3042. And initially in Greece and Russia and the Orthodox Catholic Church, and later also in Western Europe and Southern Europe, a tradition around his Saint's Day occurred, where people in the church, especially the poor and the children, received gifts to lighten their lives on that Saint's Day. And this was a Catholic tradition that carried on for centuries until around 1600, in the midst of the Dutch Reformation. It was no longer fashionable, even undesired, to celebrate Catholic Saints' Days. So the Protestant movement actually changed the narrative of Saint Nicholas into him becoming a black bogeyman that was there to scare children. So a huge transformation of the story, in which a racist motive took center stage. A man with a bag that took away children to scare children into behaving. And after around 2 centuries of Zwarte Klaas, as he was called, Black Klaas, which Klaas is like abbreviation for Nicholas, the desire or the Protestant Catholic contrasts dissipated, and he transformed into Sinterklaas, which was meant to be like a strict father figure that could have a positive impact in the education of children's behaving well. So he became a milder figure, but still a strict father figure that on the 6th of December would come visit and see if you had behaved. And if you had behaved, you would be rewarded. Now, around 1850, Jan Schenkman, a Dutch teacher, wrote a book about Sinterklaas, now coming from Spain by boat on the 6th of December with servants. And these servants were actually depicted as black servants in in clothes that resembled the Southern European and North African Moor culture, and which was way in the past. So this was a fabricated story that brought back an image of black and white, of contrast, of master and servant, putting a new racist turn to the story. And this went on until today in the Netherlands. And I want to zoom in a little bit on the moment of December the 1st, 2014, to show how that transition sort of, what our Truman moment was in the Netherlands, to become aware that this tradition is racist, systemically racist even, and that we need to transform this story. Because on the 1st of December 2014, a documentary was aired on Dutch television on primetime with the title Our Colonial Hangover. And Sunny Bergman, the journalist, she had dressed up as Black Pete and went to London with a camera crew and behaved like Black Pete would behave in the Netherlands around the same time. And she gauged the response from the audience and the people in the street. And of course, she was approached and said, "What are you doing? Are you crazy? You can't do this. This is highly offensive. Where does this idea, how can you be so ignorant?" And she tried to hold up a mirror to the Dutch people who were actually shocked by this documentary. And many of us actually awakened from this because we've all grown up in this tradition as little kids. Black Pete is not a scary figure in our experience. He was a very friendly, kind man usually. So we were like, what, are other people offended by this, by our tradition? And of course they are. Now most of us know and understand this, but this is, you could argue this is relatively late to become aware of such a thing. But it was a Truman moment, and around as next connotations, there's three main storylines. So the Kick Out Zwarte Piet movement, who really wanted to end the tradition, directly started a protest movement. The mainstream media started changing the story. So they said, the boat of Sinterklaas went through a rainbow, and now all the Piets have all the colors of the rainbow. And started changing slowly that story. But even today, last year, in the major Dutch cities, the tradition has changed. But around these cities, there's still a lot of communities that celebrate the Saints' Day with Black Piets. So it's slowly transforming. So having said that, I want to step back and sort of bring the two together, where we see that in taking turns, in thinking, in inviting the future, when we are able to be embodied in relationship with our environment, aware of metaphors that have become part of our stories that we want to change. So we focus on the metaphors that may be around us that we can't see, that have been influencing us. And then we start actively and deliberately generating new metaphors, really working through the entailments of those metaphors. In interaction, we may be able to transform these stories and to reintegrate the past into a new future. But it is hard work, it is slow work, and it needs Truman moments, mirrors of the other, to really become aware of how unaware we are of those deeply systemic, embodied past systems. Because if we're not, this metaphor has us, and the metaphor is embodied in our systems that we use every day, and we are just in our ruts moving forward. And to invoke the metaphor of jazz improvisation, if we change that rut into a groove, and we are able in full awareness together in the moment to generate this new reality, and we repeat it and we repeat it every day, we have some chance of changing it using these theories. So that's what I wanted to offer to the conversation today. And Beth, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Sergey. So just a reflection or two, and the whole idea of metaphor and the Truman moment, right? And does the metaphor have us, or do we have the metaphor? I'm thinking of the role of agency, right? Where do we have a sense of agency? And you also talked about the uneven shifts and changes, right? So if we don't have a sense of agency from ourselves, how can we call on others? Like what can we do? What kind of mechanisms can we put into place to keep reminding us? Because as we know, our habits are so strong, it's so easy to slip back into what we believe because our belief systems are so strong and the social messaging that we get is so strong that it's so deeply ingrained, so many layers that we don't know. So that was just some reflections I was thinking about. And I know that Pat will say something about that and I will too. And then we'll open it up to that. Pat, did you have anything you want to reflect on from Sergey's presentation? You'd have to unmute yourself.
No, I did not, but I was it's impressive to think back on how you were raised, what assumptions and metaphors have impacted. And now I'm going to really think about this. This is very important.
Yes, great. Thank you. Yes. And when we are raised a certain way and conditioned with certain belief systems to then question them and maybe be thrown into a situation of questioning them, it's very jarring, right? It takes the rug and pulls it out from under us. Okay, so Pat is going to talk a little bit now and she'll lead us into the next part of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Beth. This is wonderful. I am going to be speaking a little bit about lived stories, things that we have done or said or been part of that may or may not deal with the narrative of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, without further ado, I'm going to bring up 3 or 4 different situations that I have been involved with personally. They're mostly work situations, but they can be transmitted or translated to personal situations also. The first one I want to discuss is one that was said to me by a supervisor, and it was a direct quote. "I didn't know you made so much." And he was talking about my salary. And I was caught a bit unaware because I wasn't so sure what he was getting at. I didn't question him. I just said, well, that's the way it is. And I went on to take care of my own situation. But this person who made the comment did not really know much about me. I'm going to fill in some of the gap. I have 6 younger brothers and sisters. I had one older one. There were 8 of us all together from my parents. And I used to help my parents financially because they were not rich and they did a lot for each of us as children. Also, I had my own household at that time, and I am extraordinarily well educated. I have always been well educated from the time I was a child straight through to the master's degree at Columbia. So this person really didn't know me, my story, my situation, nothing. And it kind of, when I thought about it, it made me think, what do people really believe about me? So that gave me an opportunity to make some changes. One of the changes that I made was opening myself more to coworkers. Now, how I did this, when I worked in television network sales, we had to have all commercials on tape in-house by Friday for the weekend, for Saturday and Sunday, and I worked with primetime and news commercials. Now, I was not directly responsible for making sure that the commercials came into the company, but I knew the people who were. And waiting for commercials on Friday evening is nobody's idea of fun. So what I would do on Friday morning was go around to every office and wish them a happy Friday and a good weekend. And that gave me an opportunity to stay and talk for a little while so that I could be perceived as a person who was a person. Because sometimes African American people are not thought of as people. And that's a very old assumption or way of thinking about people who are descendant from slaves or who are slaves. Now, that's one experience. Another experience I had was working with colleagues who had negative or incomplete or false impressions. And it kind of relates to the first story, but I used to train people who were new to the department. I would train them in knowing the terminology, ratings, shares, BCA counties, etc. And what I realized was that some of the people I was training had impressions of me before they met me and before I started training them. Now, I don't mind training people. I think it's kind of fun. And I get to see what people are open to, and we get to talk about our past, our paths, our aspirations. This is very important. So, once I think it was the second person I was training, and I was training her in sales planning and pricing, which is a forte that I still have many years after having worked in the field. And she said to me, "Oh, I didn't know you knew about those things." I said, "Why wouldn't I?" And so she somewhat explained to me that she had been told that I really didn't have much background or know about the business that thoroughly. And I looked at her kind of with my head cocked and I said, "Oh my goodness, how untrue that that information really is." I am one of I was one of the best educated people on that floor. Out of 70 people, I think I was one of two with an Ivy League undergraduate degree. I came to work every day. I was on time. I was well presented, and it just didn't make sense to me. But anyway, what I did with that was to continue to be open to people so that their impressions, just like Sergey was just talking about, may not have been borne out as true. We have metaphors throughout our lives, and those metaphors can border on a number of different aspects of people who have been in our lives. So I tried to disprove that I did not know anything or that I was unfamiliar with the business. And I also was one of the few people who had come from another department in the company. So I was really familiar with some of the inner workings. I'm going to talk about one more encounter from that workplace. And it was an opportunity that I had to do something that was very important to the department, but that probably no one else wanted to do. I was in a small department. There were maybe 8 people. And of that 8, 3 of us were sales planners and pricers. And the other persons, we had an inventory control person, and that was the job that I volunteered to work on with the programmer. And the programmer was not so well liked partially because the way he spoke English was as a second language, and his syntax was very different from native English, American English speakers. And what he and I were able to accomplish really was what no one else had been able to do thus far. So we were able to put together an inventory system that took into consideration holds, which were areas where inventory had been promised to a particular client, and they were removed from sales inventory, but not completely removed from possibly being sold if the deal fell through. Out of the successful computerization of our inventory, I received a bonus and an expense account. So it was not all bad. And that made, I guess, for a very positive experience, because I learned a lot about the programmer and programming. The last thing that I want to really mention is that I've been a mediator for 20 years. I love mediating because it is an opportunity to help people to help themselves. And what I mean by that, people, usually two sides, come in with a conflict, a dispute, and I am able to help them speak to me, speak to each other, and to think about what their needs are under the circumstances. When I walk into the room, no one is expecting an African American woman who is older that may or may not be familiar with the situation that they bring to the table. So what I do is I wear bright light colors like pastels a lot, yellow, pink, light green, light blue, light orange. And those colors help to work on the participants so that they, even though they don't know, that they are perceiving in a different fashion. So I'm fighting all stereotypes and getting to do what I love doing and to help them also. And I think that is where I want to end. But thank you so very much for your attention today. Beth, are you?
I'm here. Thanks, Pat. So one of the things that struck me in as a constant theme through your stories is your amazing ability to, from what you said, not lose who you were. You still had a very strong centered sense of self, and you were very tolerant of the other person. And that showed in all the stories you told, it showed in the mediation work you're doing, but there was almost an acceptance of who they were for what they were, not that you had to accept it for yourself, right? So you patiently educated by leading by example of who you were and what you were. And if they got it, they got it. If not, they didn't, right? It wasn't your story. It wasn't your case to have to deal with in those ways. So it's remarkable.
You are so right. And I was never a patient person as a young person, even as a child. But I learned patience because I realized everybody doesn't have the same view or the same perception. What we have, and we have to take what we have and go move along, however that is. So, but thank you for noticing that, because there is no place in a workplace. And I never got paid for losing my temper.
I'd like to know who does.
I know.
Sergey, do you have some reflections or anything to add to what Pat was talking about?
Yes, and thank you, Pat, for sharing those powerful stories. And that's also what strikes me, the power of sharing personal experience. That allows me, especially, I think also the patience with which you share the stories today, sort of reinforces the patience you showed in those situations and the curiosity you showed in those situations. And thinking, hey, so this is how they perceive me, and allowing me to sort of live that story with you, which in turn changes my perspective. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Great. So we'll move on to my presentation. If we can have my slides, please. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about 3 points. One is about worldview, then about narrative, and about patterns, right? And this is how I'd like you to think about how it relates to DEI and A work that we're doing. So one of my favorite quotes from a long time ago is, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are," by Anais Nin, who I remember reading her diaries years ago. And one of the things that strikes me about this expression is that there is not necessarily an objective other or situation. It's that we bring who we are to everything that we see and everything that we do. And so, of course, people who study with me or learn in the program always know that self-awareness is critical. And so we need to understand what is it that's influencing how we see the world. So I just represented it here in one way as different lenses. We see things through different lenses. And at any given time, we have a whole series of lenses. Most of the time, we're not aware of what these lenses are. We're not aware of how they were made, how they came to be. And that means that if we're not aware, we didn't actively accept that these are our lenses. They just are. And a lot of that has to do with, as I listed here, some things as family, education, friends, communities, religion, cultures, our social world that we live in and that we grow up in. And one of the things I admire, for example, is certain kinds of education really indoctrinate people in a certain belief system, which works well for when they're in that space or that profession. Does not necessarily work well in other spaces, but is really working well in that space. So what we do when we have children, when we teach in an educational facility or any other time we're kind of teaching by example, is we are socializing or acculturating people into what the big system is, right? The capital narrative, the meta narrative of what is. So all of these lenses cause us to take a certain perspective, and we make the assumption that other people share the same perspective as we do, and that they carry the same assumptions we do, not necessarily being aware of what they are. And of course, when we bump into people who do not have the same assumptions as us, do not share the same perspectives, then we have the potential for having conflict, or we have the potential for offending or hurting people, right? We have the opportunity for being hurt ourselves because we make these assumptions. And we talk about the role of narrative, because all of those influences, all of those lenses that shape how we see the world create our story or the narrative we have. And there's a juxtaposition between our personal stories and our social stories, which are very layered. So I mentioned on the previous slide that we have a whole series of stories in our social world, in our environment, that influence and shape our personal story. And we go and we have experiences that reinforce certain aspects of our personal story. One of the challenges is if we want to change our story, we usually get resistance because the social stories around us are so strong. So if we want to tell a different story about who we are, it's very often challenged, because if we change our story, that means we're changing the dynamic of the relationship, and we're kind of forcing other people to change their stories, at least about who we are. So if they're changing their stories about who we are, then they're changing their story about who they are in relation to us, which means it's probably going to influence their own story about themselves. And not everybody necessarily wants to buy into that. So in this communication model I just put together, I guess in 2012, it really talks about, if you look at the 3 center circles of self, other, and context, I find that my work centers on this all the time, forever. So really it's about self and becoming self-aware, and that is life work. It's something that every time you learn something, every time you reflect on something, every time you have an interaction, there's an opportunity of developing an increased level of self-awareness. that same attention and respect we give to ourselves, we need to give to other as well. Who is that other person? Who is that person who we are having an interaction with, directly or indirectly? We need to figure out, as Pat mentioned earlier in her mediation, she wants to figure out the underlying needs. I want to understand, what is it about that other person that I need to know so I can connect with that other person? And the third inner circle is about the context. That's about the social world, about the environment. Are we in a family? Are we in a classroom? Are we in a work environment? Where are we in this context? And what's the tone? Is it a very warm, receptive, safe space? Is it a very hostile space, a dangerous space where I don't want to take a risk? I want to protect myself in that environment. And all of that is embedded in the outside culture. And that's the social world that we're in. And as I mentioned, there are many layers of culture. And the responsibility of the adults in the culture is to acculturate us or socialize us into that world, which means taking on those values, taking on the same orientation to what is right and what is wrong. And in the very center, I have there intentionally the word relationship, because all of that is about relationship. So when I think about negotiation, or I think about mediation, or I think about my work in organizations and my work in coaching and my work in communities, it's always about, what is my relationship with this other person? How am I going to be in relation? And a lot of that is through the story I tell myself about myself, and the story I tell myself about the other person, and the stories I tell myself about the relationship. If I'm happy with those stories, then I just continue on with those stories. If I'm not, and I always think there's something else that can improve, then I need to be open to shifting that story so that it works more constructively for me, for the other people in that context, in that environment. And what we notice is when we take a step back and start to look at our stories and start to look at the nature of our interactions, because there are just so many times, I don't have a number, but there are just so many times you can say it's the other person's fault. Just so many times you can say it's that person who did something, when sometimes I'll say in jest, but seriously too, what's the common denominator there? Well, you or me, whoever it is, we're the common denominator. So what is it that we're doing that is evoking this kind of response from other people? So the way we tell our narrative that gets really deeply embedded in us and creates these patterns are habits of mind and practice. Those are the assumptions. We have like a gut instinct, a gut reaction. And unless we are intentional, we'll just keep doing the same thing that we've always done, expecting different results, which we know what that leads to. So if we want to do something different, how do we shift and create a new pattern, a new habit? And one of the things that we find useful is called the Coordinated Management of Meaning, CMM, developed by Barnett Pearce and Vernon Cronin. And there are three main principles. There are many aspects of CMM, but I'll just talk about the three main principles that really influence how we are in relation to other people, which I wanted to think about in the broader context of how we are in how we live in the world, thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. So if we think about coordination, we're thinking about, how do we coordinate with other people so that we're creating a shared understanding, shared meaning making in that process. I use a metaphor of dance. So I like to dance, I like music. So if we're thinking about being in sync and dancing to the same tune, that you want to have the same rhythm with another person. You don't want to step on each other's toes, which then there'd be a lack of coordination. Another principle is coherence. As humans, we're always making meaning and trying to understand, what does this mean to me? How do I make sense of this? How does this impact me? And if it is in sync with the stories that we hold, then we have coherence. If there's something contradictory, where our assumptions are exposed, our habits or patterns are challenged, or we're allowing other influences in to shift that story, then we have a lack of coherence. A lack of coherence in ourselves probably leads to a lack of coordination with others. So those are very interrelated, between the coordination and the coherence. And the third principle is the whole idea of mystery. And as we start to understand more and more and peel back the layers of the onion and see the complexity of the world we're living in, then we get to see that there's so much mystery, there's so much ambiguity, there's so much we don't know. If you're one of those people who really wants to have control of situations, I would say you really have to start to let ambiguity in and be okay with that. It's okay not to know everything. But depending on your level of tolerance for ambiguity, that's going to influence your coherence, because if you're in that danger zone where you've reached the edge and you're no longer comfortable with that level of ambiguity, you're going to have a lack of coherence in yourself and a lack of coordination. And all of these three principles work together with each other. And so we have patterns from our worldview, from all those lenses that were created through our social narrative, through our personal narrative, that create these habits. And if we want to change those patterns, then we want to change the dynamics and the outcomes and change our social worlds. We have to think about what are the processes in which we are engaging with others, because how you engage affects the relationship and affects the outcomes, or how you're changing going forward. So I'm going to wrap up my part of the presentation now. We can do away with the slides. And then I'll just open it up to Pat and Sergey if there are any reactions to what I said, and then we'll have a discussion and open it up to the audience participants.
Thank you, Beth. It's really, it's a lot to try to make the changes. And I'm making notes because I need to make changes in myself about how I perceive or what I see as a pattern. And I've been doing this, and I can honestly say that COVID has helped me, because I don't have to run around here or be at a certain place at a certain time. Everything is being done remotely and virtually. And that has turned out to be a good thing for me, because I have time to think. I have time to come up with some other possible ways of living, being, doing, which helps me to share my own understanding of myself in a coordinated way, and gives me some, what I think of as coherence. And I always think of coherence as being a smoother road than the one that I might have lived prior to COVID. And I love mystery. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Sergey?
Yeah, thank you, Beth, and thank you, Pat, for those additional comments. And what strikes me, at least in how we are together today, as I see it, the deeply personal experiences that Pat shared, the possibly today more meta-level frameworks that I shared from theory, and this large narrative over centuries in the Netherlands, which is more abstract, and the tools you offer and the principles you shared from CMM sort of seem to go together well when we think about if these metaphors are deeply embodied in our experience, then it is the stories we live, it is the stories we tell in every moment together that offer the possibility for change and transformation. However, if we are able then to reflect into that interaction and use some of these tools and balance this coherence and this coordination and allow this mystery, which is indeed fun, which can be fun. Even the Truman moments can be fun if you think of them as learning, right? Yeah, that sort of strikes me. So how would they play together?
Great. Okay, so now we will open it up to some questions from the audience, and the panel will be very happy to answer the questions. So one question is about the extent to which our language informs our metaphors.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the metaphor theories that I shared are in a scholarly field which frames itself as cognitive linguistics. So this blends learning from cognitive science with linguistics and assumes that our mind is embodied. Whereas the linguistics school that takes metaphor as a form of linguistics is more rooted in the positive rational paradigm. So there's different ways to think about that, is one answer to this question. But how we would answer it is that these two, language and metaphor, are deeply interwoven in our experience. As we use language, metaphor is an integral part of it. We couldn't make meaning of language without it.
Great. Okay, we have another question here about metaphor, and this person who wrote the question definitely has a particular point of view. How could we apply metaphor theory to deal with people that have gone down the QAnon rabbit hole? So we're getting it. It's political, but it's also a mindset, right? It's a frame of mind about how people are thinking. So I think QAnon would be one rabbit hole. There are probably other rabbit holes, if we think of right. I mean,
Yeah, it's a question that doesn't have a clear answer, of course. But what I would, so I'm thinking about a neighbor actually in my neighborhood who also, in my perspective, has some pretty off the wall theories that he believes in. And when we it's also about, well, how I try to go about it is to stay in interaction and to keep curious and to also be able to say we don't agree. I would guess that Pat as a mediator would have more to say about this than me as a cognitive linguist, but just keep talking with each other, stay curious.
yeah. So Pat, do you want to comment on that from your experience when you're mediating and people have very strong points of view, or in general?
Yes, I think people do tend to have very strong points of view. And what I try to help them to do is to remain open. And through reframing and restating and my not taking a point of view, I have found that can help those who are at the table to stay engaged, which is what Sergey talked about. You have to remain engaged. And this engagement has taken on different dimensions. I know we do a lot virtually now, online. And but that does not excuse how we interact with each other. We still need to be respectful or courteous at the very basic. We need to listen. And I will be doing with my class very shortly at least one session, but probably two, on listening. We don't listen very well, and we have two ears for a reason. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, you said the word and it reminded me of the word and, right? So the use of the word and, I don't know if and can be a metaphor, but it's the whole symbolization of this and that. So you can have your point of view and there are other points of view, which is hard when we think about like moral conflict and incommensurate values. It at extreme ends, it's very challenging for some people around the world, in this country, around the world, to acknowledge the existence of others, right? So it's very hard when they have a very strong perspective about not even acknowledging the existence of others or their humanity. And Pat, you brought that up earlier when you weren't humanized in some of your situations. You felt that that stereotype was there very much. So, you know, sometimes as good as we can get might be just tolerance. It may not be a perspective transformation. It would be nice if everybody could be curious and open-minded and accepting, but that's not the reality. So for me, in my MO is that as long as it's not harmful to somebody else, directly or indirectly, then maybe it's okay. If it's harmful, then that's a different level. I think that needs a different level of interaction in there. But being down a rabbit hole also assumes for me that it's kind of a stuck place. There's not a whole lot of movement going on in there. So I think you'd have to take the person out of the rabbit hole, but that would be probably pretty threatening to be out in the open. Okay, another question for Sergey is what enabled the larger systems to agree to adapt their metaphors nationwide? Like why? What were the pressure points? I guess maybe talking about your story.
Yeah, I want to stress that this is only transforming slowly. I think still a majority of Dutch people in their practice thinks that Blackpeat is quite okay. But there's several things here. I think one is that after the broadcast of the documentary, the Black community in the Netherlands, for the first time, I think, started also speaking, well, for the first time visible to the white majority, started speaking out against Zwarte Piet and started a protest movement with a serious protest movement. So that became really visible. And that, I think, in turn, struck the people in the mainstream media, especially the creators of the Dutch Sesame Street, who also created the Youth Journal, and who also created the yearly Sinterklaas story on television. They were quick to respond to that and start changing the story. And they have a huge influence, of course. And there was research done that the children that are currently living in the Sinterklaas story, they even have fun that the story changes. So they are not attached to any tradition. So this is what enabled the start of the transformation. What inhibits it, I think, is the lived experience as small children to have this very warm celebration in your family every year. So it has very warm connotations, and then understanding that as being racist sort of creates a short circuit in your experience emotionally. So many people will deny this and say, no, you can't talk about my experience like that. That inhibits the change, but yeah, it must change, that's for sure.
Great, thank you. Another question is the often expressed notion that, in quotes, justice is blind, constitute a metaphor, such as you spoke of?
Yes, it does, and a strong one, because it's easy to see it as a metaphor, right? Because the justices speaking justice don't wear blindfolds. But it highlights a certain aspect of what justice should be about, where it isn't in reality, where it can be in reality, is still be done by people. Yeah.
I remember having conversations with people globally about the whole idea about countries having rule of law, right? And so when fragile states are in conflict, then they lose rule of law. There isn't justice, right? And many people have said to me around the world, but you have a very strong rule of law in the United States. And for a long time I said, yes, we do. And then I became more conscious of it more and more. And I'm like, well, we do, but it's not the same for everybody in the United States, as we know, in many ways, if you look at our prison system and so on. So this is something that's always perplexing to me, is that while we have a strong rule of law and there is justice, it's not justice for all, it's justice for some more than others. And that's part of the disturbing narrative, I think, of this country. And for sure, I'll just take responsibility in this country and not put it on others. But the whole idea about justice is blind, and then you think about, but not necessarily blind for everybody in the same way, really is a very strong metaphor when we think about. So that's a metaphor that I think needs changing. Justice is not blind, right? Another question is, how do our social identities help to reinforce our metaphors? So the way we identify socially, the different social groups that we belong to, and then they each carry different metaphors.
Yeah, so some of these metaphors appear to be universal, but the novel ones and the ones that are more to the surface and the ones that emerge, I think, are more determined by the differences in social situations, cultural situations. And the process of that emerges is actually an artful process where we experiment with different and new language. So contemporary metaphors more so than those deeply embodied, the myths that we live in. But yes, they are to an extent determined by our social relations.
So it also makes me think about, there are some social groups you choose and some that you're born into or chosen for you. And that when you are part of those social groups, in order to really be a part of that social group, you do take on the metaphors of that group. And it must be a real big disorienting dilemma, as we would say in transformative learning, to realize that the metaphors you've been living by are not the ones you really want to live by, because it goes against your conscience in some way or another. All right, so here's another question about, isn't it difficult to I guess there's an assumption in here. Isn't it difficult to transform assumptions to the general rather than the exception? Pat, did you want to talk about that a little bit from your experience in mediation, when you see people making assumptions about each other, and maybe share like a technique of what do you do to uncover some of that?
It's hard to unpack how people feel and think about others. It's not easy. And I do it for a very short space of time. And I don't think that whatever impact there may be lasts. I think it might be there for the moment, and then it may just kind of fade into the background, because what I try to do, and this is a very simplistic situation. Two neighbors, one lives below the other and hears noises at throughout the night. The person who lives upstairs says they're not doing anything to cause those noises, which is believable, especially I've had situations where the person upstairs is hard of hearing, so they don't hear at the same level or to the same level that the person downstairs may hear. Now, that may be part of the truth. The other part, another part may be that the person who is supposedly making the noise, which I always talk about as sounds, because sounds is a softer word. It does not have the same connotation. So I ask the person who is hearing the sounds to replicate or in some way let us know what they're hearing, because we don't all hear the same way, just like we don't all see the same way or perceive the same way. And this was very interesting to me, because I would have assumed, if I did not have training, I would have assumed that whatever was being heard by everybody. But that's not a proper assumption. And once the person who was hearing the sounds replicated them, it oftentimes opened up to the person who supposedly was making those sounds to try to understand what was going on, or what may have been causing the sounds, the disruption, whatever. And that's what I try to do. I just try to go a little deeper. And I try to do that with myself always. I ask questions so that I can try to begin to understand.
Great. So I think it is important to model that, the questions, and open with the mystery, the curiosity. So sometimes people make statements and they just seem so solid, and just that's the way it is in the world. And sometimes I ask myself, where did they get that from? Like, where did that come from? And I really am curious about how they formed that kind of an opinion. So there is somebody here who said that it's a person who's interested in getting into mediation. So I'm not going to ask you, Pat, for a whole rundown of what mediation is, but what they're saying is a little bit about, like, what does it entails and how does it work? And so if you just give a very general, just short intro to mediation.
Thank you. Generally, for me, becoming a mediator has meant listening carefully and suspending judgment. That may not be so easy to do. It was not that easy for me in the beginning, but once I realized that others can help me to learn, regardless of where we are or what we're doing. And I have a lot of examples of how I have learned through mediation from those who were participants. The one that stands out the most was, I am a co-op person, and I was seated with someone who was having, they thought, a problem with the co-op because their wife had passed away and everything was in both of their names. So the shareholder, who was the co-opper, agreed that maybe he needed to seek some legal advice so that he would not feel as though the co-op was taking away from him in some way. And that's what mediation is about, finding out what is happening, what can happen, so that there may be some mutual understanding about what the next steps may be.
Great, great.
Do I need to say where that training is available?
If you want to.
Yes, I think that's helpful because it took me a while to find it, but there is something called CDRCs, that is Conflict Dispute Resolution Centers. There's one in every county in New York State.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I know one of the questions I always ask myself when I see a conflict situation, what's really going on here? Because sometimes it looks minor, sometimes it looks major, but sometimes I'm not sure where the conflict is. And I say, what's really going on here? And then you're digging down. Okay, another question or comment, reflection is, the power of appealing to the physical senses feeds into broader metaphors in common: color, sound, taste, feel. Sergey, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's an important observation, I think, and I want to use CMM that you offered as tools to sort of go into that, back to the story of Sinterklaas. So Sinterklaas, as the story unfolded in the Netherlands, if you look at the different layers of context behind that story, you see shifts in color, right? A white, well, he was originally from Turkey, right? So we make it a white saint as we depict him here in the Netherlands. But the question is, what was his color when he actually lived? And but the larger context of shifting from white to black invokes sensual experience that is very different, and then of course very different meaning making. And the archetypes of, for example, the bogeyman, they don't only exist in the Netherlands, but they exist all across the world. In all cultures, they have this archetype. So there's different layers of sensual perception, emotions captured in mythical figures and archetypes that are behind these instantiations in the stories and the traditions. And because of all these layers and the relationship with our senses, it is very deeply embodied and difficult to change. But every layer in this context plays its role in reinforcing or sort of creating the dissonance that then awakens us to, hey, what's going on here? And I saw the other question, the Truman moment, refers to a movie, The Truman Show, in which the key person, Truman, lives in this created world, but something very different than usual happens. A stage lamp falls to the ground, and that sort of creates this dissonance. So if we want to dig deeper, our senses and our perceptions and awareness of those are actually guides for noticing possibilities for change, or wondering about, hey, how did this get here? Or hey, what's behind this story? Or hey, what happened before we came here, and how did it change, and in what ways did it change? And these stories or these questions go on endlessly, of course, but these sensual perceptions, colors, sounds, smells, tastes, feels are important levers, I would say, to increase our awareness.
Now we have something a little bit asking for a little reflection on the current state of affairs in the country here. So of course, we're not going to have answers because there aren't easy answers. So narrative, metaphors, layered stories, we are all different. So how do we reach a place of us together on the same page with the narratives, metaphors, and layered stories? In the US, as we struggle with the current narratives around systemic racism, how do we see together where we are, who we are, and potentially more important, who we want to be? It's a big question. Take pieces of it.
Yes, I want to take a piece of it because one of the things that humanizes us all is that we need food, shelter, and clothing. It's very basic. And once we realize that we have that in common, and then we can kind of go from there. What does that translate to? What does that mean? Where how hard is it to actually gain the basics? And once we start having that discussion, I think that some of the other things become very evident.
Interesting. So it sounds like you're saying something that I'm reflecting on in working with my colleagues in narrative medicine is going outside of the direct conversation or confrontation or whatever to something else. So you're going to a separate entity, which is, okay, we all need some of the same basic needs to survive. And what they would say is we go to the text, we look at the text, and that's a way of, I would call it like a diverting attention and then build relationship there and then bring that back, which is something we do. Go ahead.
That's what I believe Jimmy Carter did in getting Israel and Egypt to sign a peace treaty. Right. He started talking about they all three had grandchildren, and that made for a level of commonality. And then I guess the discussion may have turned to hopes and dreams and what kind of world each wanted their grandchildren to grow up in. Very important. And we use diversionary tactics all the time, especially with children. It's easy to divert children. It may not be as easy to divert adults, but sometimes it really is if we know what people like to talk about.
Yeah, so I'm going to comment here in case some people might be thinking that, well, you can't always divert. And I would totally agree with that, right? Because if you're always diverting, then you're never really addressing the issues that need to be addressed. There are some very important issues we're talking about today that need to be addressed. So what I would offer is that we divert as a way of building that commonality that we've been discussing and building those relationships and building that common ground and building the quality of the atmosphere that allows us to then together address the issues that need to be addressed in a way that's less confrontational, maybe not less comfortable, it's still uncomfortable, right, as we've talked about too, but that it doesn't get diverted forever. It's just a temporary diversion or another way into the difficult conversation. Hey, did you want to say something, Sergey?
Yeah, thanks for your beautiful answers to this question. And when I heard the question first, I was also reminded that probably given the amount of questions and also the range of questions, we can't answer every question, but I just want to acknowledge the powerful questions being asked in the Q&A by our participants, some of whom are familiar. So nice to see some familiar names also. And especially this one, because it's such a powerful question. I was just thinking, wow, the question itself changes something. So the questions themselves open up a space for thinking. But I want to reinforce what you said, doing something together that is that creates a context for then possibly talking about more difficult concepts or issues we have with each other seems a way to at least establish the situation in which we are listening and inquiring and curious. Because if we don't have that, then the only way we have is through media which makes it, which makes it at least tenfold more difficult.
Absolutely. Very nice reflections. The next question is for Pat.
Mhm.
How should I respond to people who may stereotype initially, then learn about your credentials, but still want to discredit? I've experienced this before and was told education doesn't mean you are smart. Any
It-
tips on how to handle this?
It doesn't mean you're smart to get an education. What it does mean is that I always tell people that a formal education in school means that several experiences have been compiled into a way that can be taken in by students. Now, what I don't brag ever, because I don't think there's any benefit in letting people know that I have something you may not have. All that does to me is intensify conflict. I never tell people where I went to school, except I did do it here. But I'm getting older and I just talk sometimes. But when I worked in a company, someone asked me where I went to school. I'd say the best. And they kept picking and prying. And finally, after maybe the fifth time, and we were the only two people around, I stated where I had gone, and he opened up immediately. My sister-in-law went there. She is this, that, and the other. It was so interesting, but that has not been your experience. So I just wait people out. I use the corporate tactic on them. Wait, wait, wait. And I developed a way of letting them know that I understood what they were asking, and that when I was ready, I may or may not let them know.
Hmm.
Mystery.
Yeah, it just reminds me of something that I would also teach in negotiation is staying in control of the
Mhm.
process, you know? So when somebody asks you a question, they're taking control of the conversation, right? They're directing it. So you have a choice, which some people don't think they have the choice, but you have the choice how to respond in that situation. And if it's not a comfortable question, or if you see the underlying implications of where they're going and you don't want to go there, then you don't answer that question, or you direct it, or you do whatever you want, but you regain that control. And it doesn't have to be confrontational, but they also might eventually develop the awareness that she's not answering my question. And maybe they'll reflect and think, well, why? And maybe that wasn't the appropriate question to ask, but maybe not.
Mhm.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That is very important. And I'm not a controlling person, even though I do make sure that I am in control of me and my lane.
There you
I
go.
love being in my lane.
And you'd like people to stay in theirs. And by not answering that question, you're keeping them in their lane, right? Because they've crossed over. Very subtle. Okay, there's a question for me here. Could you talk a little more about coherence, please? Could you maybe give a practical example of a breakdown in coherence and how that affects coordination? So let's just say, for example, if I'm in the workplace and I have expectations that people will do certain things or behave a certain way or respond in a certain way, or I'm just making an assumption that people will do the right thing, right? And that gives me coherence because I understand how I'm supposed to operate. I'm making meaning in the world and so on, and I get it. But then if somebody does something differently from what I expect, then it jars me and I have to rethink, why did I have that expectation? But it also challenges or maybe changes the relationship I have with that person, because I don't know necessarily why that person did what he or she did, and I need to find that out. So it could be where my initial reaction may not be what my subsequent reaction is, but my initial reaction may be, whoa, what's going on here? Why would that person do that? And then because I've been in this field a long time, I have to then quickly think, okay, what's going on? I need to explore and find out. It's the mystery of why that person didn't do something I thought. So it initially affects my coordination, And then when I find out more about why that person did what he or she did, it may give me more coherence or not, because it still may be very different from the way I think things should be. And it may alter subsequent coordination with that person because I have a different way of understanding that person and understanding that person in relation to me. So that's what happens in the workplace. And I know as a consultant to other workplaces, that happens a lot in the work. And you have a lot of people working in teams and a lot of people having implicit expectations about what they think everybody on the team should be doing, but not everybody does what one person thinks they should be doing because people think differently. And maybe it hasn't been clarified, which happens a lot. Roles and responsibilities haven't been clarified. So there are assumptions about who's doing what. And maybe you have redundancy and people step on each other's toes, or you have these big gaps where certain things that should be done do not get done. That affects team coordination a lot, right? And it's disturbing and really affects people's coherence. So those are just some examples. I'm not sure if Pat or Sergey wanted to add to that.
No, I relate with that, Beth. I think it's a great exposition. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to hear, what is transformational story? What is a transformational story that has moved you deeply in your own life? Pat, you want to answer that?
What I like to do is to read books. And when I read, I get transported into a whole other way of thinking and a whole other place. Some of the reading that I have been able to do is about figures who we know of publicly, but may not know personally, such as Barbara Bush, who is no longer living, but she's a very interesting person. Elizabeth Dole. These people have come from places where they may not have had exposure to the experiences that we know them from. Hillary Clinton is another one. Okay, I'm going to name some African American people now. Malcolm X in the autobiography. What an interesting person. And I met his wife after he had been killed. She was the funniest person. I was on a committee with her. I used to try to get to the meetings early so I could make sure that I got a seat next to her, because she saw things in a way that helped my vision to expand and for me to become more exploring than I may normally have been. And the same is true. I'm trying to think, what I'm trying to do now in my class, which is the sociology of conflict resolution, I'm trying to bring other voices that we don't necessarily read, but who are great conflict resolvers, such as, I'm trying to think of the name of the woman who helped to set up the United Farm Workers Union with Cesar Chavez, a very influential woman who had, I think, 9 children, if you can imagine. Because for me, even though I'm from a large family, I can't imagine the management that it takes to make sure that every young person has what they need as a member of the family. Oh my God, I can't remember this woman's name. And she was the first person that I thought of when I was thinking of whose writings or who can I introduce into this course, who has been a conflict resolver, maybe not a traditional one, but who has something to say. Okay, I'm going to move on from her to, oh my God, I'm having such a blank now, but there's a civil rights worker. Oh, there's several of them. One of them was Hillary Clinton's mentor. who was the first African-American woman who became admitted to the bar in Mississippi. And these people they're amazing. They're seminal. They use tactics that we may have seen before, but we did not know that may have been utilized for whatever the outcome, the expected outcome was. And this is very important. These are people who have impressed me as a African-American woman. And then when we see people like Kamala Harris and the former president's wife, Michelle Obama, these are people who have really, I was going to say overcome tremendous odds, but that's not really what it is. What they do is they don't think in traditional ways. And because of that, they don't get traditional outcomes.
Great. There are so many more questions and we don't have that kind of time. So make a suggestion that if people's questions were not answered, or if anybody wants to follow up, you can just reach out to the NECR program or reach out to me specifically, B as in boy, F as in Frank, 2017 at columbia.edu. I will share questions and comments with Pat and Sergey, and we will respond to you. And again, you will be getting the link, and this will be posted on YouTube and the NECR site. Just going to ask Sergey and Pat to share any reflections in closing. Sergey?
Yeah, thank you, Beth. Well, this was a great experience doing this together and having an audience with all these provocative and deep questions for us to jam on, and also that we had quite some time to do that together. And so I want to thank you, Pat, and you, Beth, and the organizing team of the webinar, and especially our audience for making this together with us.
Super. Thank you so much, Sergey. And Pat?
Echo. Thank you, Sergey. And this has been informative for me also, and I love it. Thank you.
Great. So I also want to share my appreciation with Sherston for organizing all of this with us, and for the media team and the events team for helping coordinate it, and for so many participants who are here. We feel your energy, really appreciate your provocative questions, as Sergey said, because this is just the tip of the iceberg about all the things that we could say and we could dive into together. So we love the opportunity to co-create the dialogue that we had here today. But again, like I said, it's only the tip. So if you have interest in more of these types of sessions, then please let us know. We will be happy to participate. We have lots of wonderful colleagues who we would love to bring into the conversation more centrally into what we're saying. And then I think I'll just call it a day and a wrap. So thank you, everybody, for participating. And I'm not sure if anybody else has anything to say from the host side, but otherwise, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.